Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the summit stage. Or if you have not been here before, welcome for the first time. This is CogX 2020. It's an unusual conference in that we can't see each other, but we can actually connect with each other digitally via your apps. So if there's somebody you know, somebody you can see in the room, somebody, a contact, do please make a connection. We're going to sit down for I think one of the most interesting conversations today. It is with one of the finest minds of the 21st century, Anne Applebaum, discussing The Twilight of Democracy, her latest book. The person who's going to be discussing this with her is Azeem Azhar, and he is the founder of Exponential View. Azeem, I'm going to hand over to you.
Now, if we just take a longer swathe of history back through the 20th century, it seems that we are at or close to all-time highs in the number of democracies on the planet. According to the Varieties of Democracy project, we are nudging 100 democracies and only 80 autocracies across the globe. When I was born, those numbers were more than reversed. There were only 40 democracies at the time, back in 1972. Your book is called Twilight of Democracy. What are those rosy graphs hiding?
Well, the rosy graphs are hiding the deterioration of democracy and the decline of democracy, including in some of the biggest and most stable and most prosperous democracies. In many countries, the quality of democracy has declined. The satisfaction of people with democracy has declined. There's quite a lot of, if we're doing graphs and polling, there's a lot of really interesting polling that splits it up generationally, that asks whether asking people, over 60, over 40, and around the age of 20, whether they trust democracy, whether democracy is important to them. And in literally one Western country after the next, the numbers decline quite dramatically. Younger people, in the United States, at very, have very low numbers of feeling attached to democracy, surprisingly low, and even in countries like Sweden, where there's a lot of social consensus about the political system and so on, you still have markedly lower numbers. So we see a kind of decline in trust in the systems and a kind of decline in effectiveness. And in a few places, we've seen democracies become dictatorships in a way that we didn't think was possible. We've seen, the most famous one in Europe is Hungary, which is a country that doesn't really have free elections anymore. The political system is skewed in various ways to make sure that the ruling party always wins. But we've seen declines in Turkey. We've seen declines in the Philippines. It's an international problem. And most people who study democracy have remarked on that. And my book, which is actually a very personal book, and a lot of it is anecdotal, and it's not about the statistics, but is an attempt to explain why. What are some of the reasons, and what are some of the attitudinal changes?
Help us understand why the younger generations consistently seem to be developing an ennui with democracy. Is it as simple as they've forgotten what it was like to live under, or they've never experienced living under an autocracy, or is there more going on than that?
Certainly there's an element of that. There's an element of, particularly in Europe, there's an element, and the United States, but especially Europe, there's an element of, we don't remember the war and all those stories that people told us about how terrible the 1930s were. We don't feel it personally, and really almost nobody certainly nobody in politics today has clear memories of that. But I think there are other things going on as well, because this is a problem that isn't just a Western European problem, and it's not just afflicting countries that had a big involvement in the war. Again, you look at Philippines, look at Turkey, look at India, which is another country that's had very dramatic declines in the quality of its democracy. In my book, I give a lot of different explanations, and again, some of them are individual to particular countries, but certainly one. Maybe we can talk about two or three of them. One of them is to do with the pace, not just the fact of economic change and not just the fact of inequality, but the pace of economic change and the sense that people have of losing control. Their countries, their democracies don't really don't really control and own their, they don't, own their economies in the way that they once did. Someone can make a decision in Shanghai and you can lose your job in Sweden, or someone can make a decision in Washington or Brussels and you can lose your job in Sicily. And people, the feeling that these are our governments and we somehow control them has, and this is a byproduct of globalization as well as the speed of economic change. In the book, I go into at great length subject that I know that you're interested in, which is the way in which social media has also changed the way that people everywhere, actually, but particularly in democracies, perceive the state, the way they perceive power, the way they perceive politicians, and the nature and quality of political information has changed very dramatically. And when you look back in history, when you look at over time, every time there has been such a major change before, if you look at the invention of the printing press, or you look at the invention of television and radio, each time that has happened, new political actors have arisen who understand better how to use that new technology. And that's clearly happened now. I mean, it's not just a question of social media. It's also the question of the internet and the way in which we get news in general. We now see political news on our phones. We see, something about a celebrity, something about the weather, something about the stock market, and then a little flicker about one of Trump's tweets, and then we move on. So the nature of how we see and perceive politics has changed quite a lot.
So there are two themes there that I think are worth, hopefully we'll have time to tackle both of them. The first being about the speed of economic change, and the second around social media and the way in which people form their understanding of the political sphere. Let's tackle that second one. Democracy has always been connected to the technologies, the media communications technologies of the time, perhaps, as you say rightly, starting with the printing press. What really has been the issue that you've seen as you've surveyed the world with what social media has done for the political debate and the way in which people form their opinions?
So it's not just social media. It's also the nature of news. I mean, it's even to do with the way the mainstream media has changed. But the feeling of distance that people now have from politics and from their political leaders has increased. So the internet is a space where the virtual world is a space where irony and parody and jokes. It's not an accident that those are the dominant mode of communication in a lot of forms of social media, because those are because it's a form of media that people who are using it feel distant from the subjects that they are talking about, because nobody else is there when it's not like having a conversation with people in a room. Social media has also, it's become much more easy than it used to be to live inside filter bubbles. And this is a phenomenon we all know now very well, that the ease with which people can only hear news and information that they want to hear, or news and information that confirms their sense of themselves and their identity. So politics is now it's not just a choice of, do we build a road here, or do we build a petrol station? Politics is also about who am I, which club do I belong to, which tribe do I belong to, and the internet has increased that sensibility. I mean, of course, it's also changed the nature of political parties. Political parties in European countries used to be, there used to be a kind of center left that was based on a real live trade union movement. And it came from real meetings that people were having in actual rooms and talking to one another. And the center right in many countries was also based on real institutions, very often church institutions. Christian democracy in Europe was very closely related to kind of church groups and so on. And again, these were real institutions. Political parties now are very often places that people find online. People find worlds or worldviews that they agree with. And this is one of the reasons why in many countries, not every country, but in many countries, the traditional parties have fallen apart. and new parties have arisen, and people are attracted to new parties for different reasons. So the social media, and I should stress that this isn't all bad. It's not necessarily evil or wrong. It's just very disruptive. Right. The third point I would make is to do with trust. One of the things that social media and internet media, and also kind of much faster moving mainstream media has done, is it has, again, reduced politics to the level of entertainment. People don't trust less and less the sources of information. And that means in turn that they don't trust political institutions either. Again, when you have these very deep divisions, when you have very polarized societies, as you do in the US, as you do in Poland, which is where I am now, then people often feel that if the opposition party controls the government or controls the mechanisms of the state, then your feeling that those are somehow jointly owned is undermined. So people don't feel that state institutions are owned by everybody. They feel they're owned by one party or another, if that makes sense. And that undermines the respect for the institutions, for the neutrality of the law, for the neutrality of judges, neutrality of the bureaucracy, and so on. And that you can see that happening in, I would say, most democracies now.
I mean, that latter phenomenon was something that we witnessed in the UK just around the sort of the Brexit conniptions and Theresa May's premiership moving on across to Boris Johnson with attacks on the judiciary and attacks on the civil service. And of course, in the US, I guess we have attacks on the deep state, which is a sort of sense of the competent technical bureaucracy that exists within various government departments. And that was, I think, novel for many of us living in these Western democracies. But I know it's a bit of an unfashionable thing to say, but I want to just test this with you. You described a set of complex issues in terms of polarization and trust. And I just wonder whether those don't predate Mark Zuckerberg's brilliant invention of 2005, whether we were starting to already see a growing polarization, increasingly extreme voices. I mean, I think it was the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter that the American FCC allowed radio stations to sort of unchain themselves from any sense of balance and equal reporting, and allowing the marketplace to determine what was reasonable. Do you think that we might overemphasize the role of the social networks and the way in which people sometimes use them to get their news and information as we start to look at the current predilection of democracy?
Oh, absolutely. None of these phenomena are new. And actually, in my book, I talk about one of the most famous incidences of, rapid and extreme polarization in modern history, which took place around the Dreyfus affair in France. And this is in the late 19th and early 20th century, before even broadcast media. This was about newspapers in Paris. So it's these are very, very old phenomenon and nothing new at all. All that we've had recently is the things that used to take a long time now simply happen faster. And the speed with which polarization can happen, and the speed with which people can lose trust and faith in the government has picked up. I mean, but if you think about it, there's also not it's not very surprising that political figures and political ideas that do well in one form of media might not do well in another form of media. This is, we saw this in Hollywood, when we went from silent movies to talkies, to movies where there was sound. There were actors who made it and actors who didn't, who were their new, their talents didn't translate into the new medium. And I think we've seen that in the modern world too. I mean, I should add, one of the other features of social media is that is that even the even people who aren't using it are sometimes affected by it in ways that they don't realize. So there's lots of statistics about how not everybody gets their news from Facebook, and of course that's true. But the trouble is that the people who are reading the news on television and the people who are commenting on the news and the Fox News presenters and the CNN presenters, they're reading it. Right. And so it has an impact on the way news is talked about and perceived, even among, even when people aren't necessarily using it themselves. I mean, it's not that well understood, but I mean, Twitter is a hugely influential medium of politics, even though most of the world is not on Twitter, but it nevertheless curates the conversations of journalists and others in certain ways. And that then has other knock-on effects.
And to what extent are we really talking about a twilight of the previous configuration of democracy, which was a particular type of politician with a particular personality, a certain type of party hierarchy and structure and strategy that needs to be refreshed as we move into this new world? And I just throw out a couple of thoughts to this. Communications have always been at the heart of democracy, and we can now communicate far better than even Gutenberg's wildest dreams. And the second is the expression of the vitality of in the US and the UK. I mean, we've seen these enormous protests in the last week in the US, and Philadelphia was incredible, and we had a couple of million people come out for various marches during the Brexit process. Those seem to be democratic expressions. So in some sense, are we contending less with a sort of a decline in the appeal of democracy, but more a suppressed need that the existing infrastructures and mechanisms are not capable of meeting, and therefore they need a kind of renewal?
Yeah, well, that's a third, that's another piece of, this is a broad story. And yes, of course, there's another piece of the story, which is that the institutions of democracy and even of the state that were created for a previous, pre-internet era, again, this isn't even about media, it's about, aren't necessarily suitable or as functional in the present. I mean, in the US, look, one of the reasons you're seeing the demonstrations that you're seeing is that people genuinely don't feel represented by the current administration, in other words, and by the current configuration of power in the United States. And in a way that's understandable. I mean, look, the way our electoral system works in America, the Electoral College made Trump president, even though he'd lost the popular vote. The Senate is dominated by Republicans from the Midwest and from more rural states, even though most of the population of the country is on the coasts and in the cities. And so there is a democratic deficit in the United States that a lot of people are underrepresented, and they feel underrepresented by the government. And the protests that we're seeing are, that's part of why. People feel frustrated. They're unable to get the kind of change that they want through the existing institutions. I mean, there are other ways in which, look, you and I can go online and we can buy a book or buy a pair of shoes in 15 seconds, and then it'll be delivered to us the next day. To get change in democracies is unbelievably long and time consuming, to create consensus and to use all the old mechanisms of coalition building. Which is, of course, even worse in some countries where you have multi-party systems. It can take a long time to form a government. People now find democracy kind of slow and unsatisfying, and it's not able to give people the results with the kind of speed they've learned to expect in other spheres of life. And this is reflected in the kind of dissatisfaction people feel both with their political systems and with the state itself.
Well, that is that is an incredibly insightful observation, that the mechanisms or processes of democracy just move too slowly in a one-click world. Are there any examples where democratic societies have figured out how to improve that process? I mean, I'm thinking perhaps there are mechanisms of engagement like citizens' juries or other sort of types of participatory functions which allow for a more ongoing engagement. So even if the process is slower, people feel like something's happening. Or are there are other examples that align the speed of democracy with the speed of this exponential world?
mean, I can point you to one or two places. I can point you to, okay, Estonia, very, very, very small country. All right.
Yeah.
But this is a country that made, partly because of the experience of enduring cyber attacks from Russia, that made the kind of digitalization of public life a huge priority. So everybody in Estonia has a kind of online identity that works like an ID card. So you can do all kinds of things in Estonia online that we wouldn't dream of in the United States or even the UK. You can vote online. All kinds of government services are available online. And the government has made the teaching of programming and computer science in schools a priority, so that it's part of the curriculum from primary school onwards. And this is it's not a constitutional change. I mean, I think in the United States we may be at the stage of needing deeper constitutional changes, which we can talk about if you want. But there are a deeper reform of the state and a digitalization of the state. Some Scandinavian countries have experimented with the elimination of cash and the use of just online currency as a way to eliminate all kinds of boring bureaucracy to do with money that will make people feel like things work better. So a lot of that is just efficiency. But the deeper point about participation, I mean, look, some of the most interesting, for better or for worse, new political parties have been created over the last several years have been created as online organizations. I mean, there's a very interesting and rather weird political party in Italy, which is the Five Star Movement, which is essentially an internet group. I mean, That's how it was founded. It was a computer program. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but that people could log into and be part of and take part in direct democracy and voting in very particular. So it's a little bit, it doesn't quite work the way it was supposed to work. And there's some suspicion that in fact it was manipulated in various ways. But leaving that aside, the idea of that was clearly very appealing to people. And it may be that political parties need to think harder about how they involve people in decision making. It may be that they need new ways of recruiting and speaking to people. I mean, again, another party that's described in my book, and this is a far right party, Vox in Spain, is a political party that put together a coalition of kind of ignored issues, things that other people weren't talking about and weren't being dealt with, again, by the mainstream political parties, including things like hunting, which is not a mainstream issue in Spain. But there's a small group of hunters who really care about hunting, and this party spoke to them. So again, thinking of political parties as coalition building with different audiences in a slightly different way than used to be. In other words, finding ways of relating to people directly may be part of the answer. I mean, look, Emmanuel Macron tried something with, hard to say, with some success and not entirely, which was to do a huge, when he was very unpopular a year or so ago, which was to do this series of town halls, to spend a huge amount of time going around the country, meeting people as if it were an election campaign. And those are tactics by political leaders, but I suspect it's parties and political organizations that will have to lead this. In other words, to create some sense of connectedness.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges for parties is, as you described earlier, their old affiliations are slowly being nibbled away. I mean, as the societies get more secular and less religious, in many cases, the church affiliation weakens, and labor movements have generally weakened, and the industries that they represented are often being eviscerated through digital change. And so then the curious question is, what are the issues around which people will coalesce? One of the things that struck me has been, we discussed this when we were talking last week, has been the idea that in these moments of very fast change, technologically driven economic change, and therefore alongside that, some changes to sort of social mores and values, there is an authoritarian dynamic. There is a response that a certain group of people have against that change, which then becomes the commonality. So you have on the other side a kind of a group of people who are rather more comfortable with the change or certain types of it, but they're very heterogeneous and disaggregated, and but there is a kernel of people who find the pace of change very uncomfortable, and that can often be a driver of, say, a Leave vote in Brexit or a Trump vote in the US. Is that first of all, is that a reasonable sort of categorization or description? And if it is, what do you think the ongoing implications are for the formation of these new parties, given that change is not likely to slow down in the coming decades?
So this is a big theme of my book, and it's something I've written a little bit about in my journalism as well, which is that it's pretty clear that there is a percentage of the population which doesn't like change and which doesn't like complexity, and also which doesn't like sharp disagreement. I mean, is literally bothered by cacophony. So there's a way in which, the deepening of polarization, as people become angrier and angrier at each other, this group is even more inflamed and is itself becomes angrier. So, and this is why authoritarians in history have always used polarization as a tool. If you can get people arguing with one another bitterly, then you can impose silence on everybody. And then you can kind of achieve a forced consensus and take power. I mean, and that's, it's a known tactic. I mean, this is how it's done: is you polarize a society, but the point is, and in the book I rely a little bit on the work of a really interesting kind of behavioral psychologist called Karen Stenner, who has identified people who are bothered by complexity and bothered by rapid change. And one of her arguments is that, look, there are people like that always in society. They're bothered by fast change. They're also bothered. Sometimes these are the people who are bothered by rapid demographic change. It's not just economic change. So when the nature of their country seems to be changing a lot, they're bothered by that. It's not necessarily, it can be racism. It isn't necessarily, but they react against it. And one of her arguments, and this is something that I've come to think of, is that, that part of society also needs to be accommodated. In other words, something has to be offered to people who dislike rapid change. They need some kind of stability. I mean, this was the insight of, whether Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s or the British welfare state in the 1950s. You offer people some baseline of security. Nowadays, I think it's different from what it used to be, but you offer them some security, you offer them some stake in the society, you offer them some sense of peace. There are social deals that can be done, so that the people who like diversity and the people who are frightened by it can somehow live side by side, because otherwise, we'll get this deep polarization and difference. There's also a lot of evidence that just calming down the rhetoric, finding ways of unifying people, also makes people feel better. And there's another political example. There's you can tell I'm a connoisseur of odd European elections, but
right.
There was an election in the past year in Slovakia, where which has been also a very bitterly divided society. There's a big problem with corruption. There was a terrible murder of a journalist that was blamed on a kind of mafia clan. And one of the characters who emerged from the kind of scrum of angry politicians was a woman who was an environmental lawyer, Susanna Chaputova, who offered, a kind of argument about unity, and she managed to tie together, again, she was created a coalition, sort of people who cared about the environment, plus, which is a lot in Slovakia, not just in the sense of climate change, but more generally in the sense of environmental deterioration. People who cared about judicial reform, and also people who wanted some kind of consensus. And she was able to offer a consensus and a kind of calming form of consensual rhetoric that people liked, and they voted for her. So there are other kinds of, it is partly concrete. What are the economic changes that we can. I mean, in the United States, for example, it is 100% crystal clear that there has to be some kind of deal on healthcare. There has to be, we can't go on like this, having a huge part of the population be, much more likely to fall sick than the other half. And, some kind of social arrangement has to be made so that that's no longer true. And it may be that in exchange for that, we do need to slow the pace of immigration or slow some elements of change, so that other people are happy with it. So I mean, there needs to be some kind of trade-off. There needs to be some form of accommodation, so that we can all live in one society together.
It seems like that a number of the themes that lead to that level of dissatisfaction and disquiet, which relate to change, are intimately connected with the model of technocratic capitalism of the last 40 years, in the sense that we wanted increasingly free movement of people. We wanted to get our supply from China, or we wanted to have customers in Stockholm. And at the same time, our machinery of production was creating more and more innovation. I was just getting used to Facebook, and then along came Instagram, and then along came the next thing, which I've lost track of now. But that pace of change seems to hit that disquiet lever for a certain group of the population. So is there some sense in which that overarching system, which was a sort of efficiency-driven, innovation-driven, let's take out, I'll use a Chernobyl example here, let's take out the control rods from the reactor, and let the technology of the economy run at high speed, is that, in the sense, inimical to a stable democratic polity?
I mean, I think it's the pace of change, when it's that fast, it undermines people's sense of security and their ability to plan, and their faith in the idea that their children will be able to have the same kinds of lives that they had, or better lives, as we came to expect in the United States and Western Europe. So yes, the political system is going to have to find trade-offs. I mean, we don't want to lose innovation. We don't want to lose efficiency. We don't want to lose, I think interconnectedness and trade also have advantages. They bring things to society as well. Of course, travel and movement, maybe even more so. And so the question is, what's the trade-off? How do we compensate people? What are the elements of stability we can give them that will enable them to feel comfortable in this new world?
And we have about 10 minutes left on this stage. So I just want to put a call out to the attendees and to remind them that if they do have questions for Anne, to, I guess, put them in whatever chat window you have, and they will get filtered up to us, because it would be great to hear from you as well. We do have one question that's come in, which is, how do we reconcile the fact that our democracies derive their legitimacy within geographic borders, but some of our key challenges are global? I mean, COVID being one, and climate change, I guess, being another.
I mean, that's the question of the moment. Yeah. I mean, the question is, how do we reconcile demands for the kind of relocalization of political conversation with the fact that the real challenges, whether health challenges or climate challenges or economic challenges of the future, are going to be global? I mean, the mechanisms that we've created to sort of negotiate between the local and the global, we know them. I mean, the European Union is one. Other kinds of international organizations. I mean, the UN system is very creaky and maybe too big in general, but it's also pieces of the UN system. I mean, the WHO, which has been rightly criticized in the last couple of months for some of its failures in the early stages of the pandemic, nevertheless is the organization that, when there is a vaccine invented, will be the thing that makes sure it gets to most of the world. It will get to Africa, and it will get to South America, and it will, and the vaccines and the cures and the advice and so on will go through WHO channels. So we we do have these international organizations. It's just that a lot of them need major refreshing. They need rethinking. They need to be turned from big bureaucracies into sort of, some kind of networked organizations. I had a conversation recently with a virologist at Johns Hopkins University who said, the fact is that although it looked at the beginning of this crisis like all the international organizations had fallen apart and nobody was doing anything, actually the world's virologists were talking to one another all the time and exchanging information, including with their colleagues in China. And so there has been this scientific conversation that's been going on very productively, even as the political conversation has been terrible. And if we could somehow make that form of, the substantive scientific conversation, if we could somehow raise it and make it and facilitate it, and make that, put that more at the heart of what the WHO is and what it does, that would be useful. But I agree, these are the problems. The problem is that the issues are local, the issues are global. Politics is local, and we may need to reinvent what we mean by international organizations in order to solve some of these problems in a more intelligent way.
Yeah, that example of the network scientists and the rate of innovation is a great counter to all of the negatives that we've been discussing about networked societies. And in a sense, they've created global public goods, right, amongst the virologists. That's what they've gone off and done in a way that we haven't with our, multilateral institutions. I'm just hearing I may have sound issues. Can you hear me clearly, Anne?
I can hear you now.
Now and everyone else can too. The other question, I suppose, that comes to mind when we think about global issues is that when we look at that period after 1945, which was the real sort of acceleration of democratization across the globe, there were a couple of things going on. There was decolonization, the independence right across the world. And there was a US model that was being exported through US multinationals and aid and a whole bunch of other things. But there wasn't really an appealing counterweight, unless you considered tanks rolling in through Budapest in 1956 as an appealing counterweight. Today, there is, maybe it's not appealing, but there is a counterweight. There is a sort of Chinese model that is working. There is a strong export orientation, particularly around certain technologies and technologies for governance that come out of China. And we do understand that through One Belt, One Road, there's a concerted effort to perhaps not enforce an entire Chinese model, but certainly tweak the direction of countries that are in that sphere of influence. Do you think that as we look at those countries in that periphery, they do face for the first time an alternative to just an American-style democratic path?
Well, first of all, actually, communism had a great appeal, and the Soviet system, did have an ideological pull all around the developing world, and all around the world, actually, including in Europe after the war. Certainly in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s, 70s, maybe by the 80s it began to fall apart. So this is not totally new idea that liberal democracy is somehow challenged by an authoritarian system. But yes, you're right. The Chinese have actually been better at making the ideological argument for their system than the Soviets were, precisely because they've had so much more economic success. The Chinese can say, look, we made ourselves prosperous, having been a very poor country. Whereas the Soviet Union, seemed to become poorer as the years went by. So there is an alternative. And actually, it's true. China is working very determinedly and steadily to try to capture and influence UN and international institutions. It's using the Belt and Road Initiative to, in effect, often to fund and support autocracies around the world. There's often an understanding when loans are given through the Chinese system that if somebody skims a little bit off, nobody's going to notice. It's a very untransparent system. So yes, it is a, the Chinese are seeking to set themselves up as competitors. And I do think that one of the effects of the disaster that the coronavirus has caused in the United States will be to weaken at least the American hand in the world. As people saw how, that it wasn't just that Trump couldn't negotiate with other countries. I mean, he couldn't even, the federal government in the United States couldn't even negotiate between American states, their reaction. And I think all of that will be a kind of, it's hard, these things are hard to measure, but it is a kind of psychological blow to democracies that we will have to overcome. And so, yes, I hope that one of the effects of the virus and the shock that it's caused to the system will be that people start to rethink international institutions. How do we use them? What kind of language do we use in them? And how do we use them how do we return to some of the ideas that the idea that we need, that it's not just democracy, it's also accountability and transparency that we need to encourage the rest of the world to use, because it's good for us as well.
Now, we've got a couple of minutes left. So a question came in about the female leaders. So for the first, I think we have more elected female heads of state, or heads of government rather, now than we've had in a while. And actually in the context of the COVID pandemic, they have done quite well. Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel and Kersti Kaljulaid in Estonia and others. I'm curious about whether we can generalize from their experiences, and do we have any reason for why those women-led governments and nations have done better from COVID? Is it something to do with the style, or is it just the individuals, or is it other factors?
I mean, it's always hard to create a general theory out of 3 or 4 examples, so I'll be very circumspect. I mean, my guess is that, let's think how to say this, is that the countries that elect women leaders are also countries where there are higher levels of trust and less antagonism and polarization in the system. And I say that, I'm already thinking of some exceptions, and Evita Peron and so on, but what determined whether people did well, there were a lot of things that determined it. Basically, but one of the most important factors was, did people trust the government? Did they trust the political system? And did they trust the bureaucracy? Mm-hmm. And those are all these women, if you talk about Merkel or the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and these are people who've come to power, who've based on arguments about trust and unity and consensus. And, there are men who can do that too. Maybe at this particular moment in history, there are some women who are particularly good at that. But I think if you study the relationship between the sense of trust and those leaders, you would find the explanation somewhere in there. That's my guess.
Fascinating. So just one last question from me, which is, in a sense, it's a counterfactual. Would we be having this discussion if Hillary Clinton hadn't used the phrase basket of deplorables, if she had got those 79,000 key votes in the 3 states she needed? I mean, in short, if she had won the 2016 election?
I think we'd still be having it. Remember what Trump's plan was had he lost. He planned to create a new television station, and he would have essentially kept campaigning. I mean, he would have continued to barnstorm around the country and talk about the deep state and chant lock her up. So I think we'd be having a different kind of crisis in the United States. And then, of course, all the elements that I've described, continue to play themselves out in Hungary and Poland and France and Germany and Spain. So I think we'd have it anyway. Trump kind of focused our attention in a way, but I don't think the United States is an exception.
Anne Applebaum, your new book, Twilight of Democracy, I think is available for pre-order on Amazon. I'm sure for everyone who's given 45 minutes to this discussion, they will want to go now and one-click it, so it's ready for them in July. Thank you very much for giving us your time this afternoon.
Thanks very much. Thanks to you. Thanks, great questions.
And I can say I've already one-clicked it and I've got it in my basket waiting to go. Thank you. That was an extraordinary broad sweep on the the main theme, challenges are global, but actually all politics is local. How do we disentangle ourselves from this particular situation? We're going to be continuing this theme on the summit stage for CogX for the next session, which is Will Populism Recede, and will there be a return to the centre ground, with speakers including Joe Swinson, former leader of the Liberal Democrats. And later on this evening, we've got John Kerry, US Secretary of State, speaking. So thank you all for attending this. Do get onto Amazon right now, or perhaps a local bookseller if that's your thing instead. And see you all shortly for the next session. That's at 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.